It was the spring of 1945. The Pacific burned. American fleets crept closer to Japan island by island. Okinawa was next. And then, the sky began to scream. They came diving out of the sun. Wings trembling. Engines howling. White headbands flashing in the light. Pilots, barely 20 years old, flying their machines straight into American ships. Each one carried a bomb. Each one was a human bomb. Their name was Kamikaze. The Divine Wind. A name born from ancient legend, now reborn in fire and despair. To the Americans they were madness made flesh. To the Japanese High Command, they were the last hope to stop the unstoppable. And to the young men themselves, they were told it was honor. It was duty. It was the only way left to serve the emperor. Some believed it. Others trembled. But once the order came, there was no turning back. In less than 1 year, over 3,800 kamikaze pilots would turn the sky into a graveyard. Their attacks sank or damaged hundreds of Allied ships. And yet, they could not change the outcome of the war. What drove them to do it? Was it faith? Was it fear? Or something much deeper, a nation's final breath before collapse? Tonight we journey into that moment. Into the faces, the hearts, and the silence that came before impact. If you want to understand the men behind the fire, stay with this story. Listen to the voices of those who lived, and those who never came back. Take a moment, follow this journey through to the end. Because once you hear it, you'll never see the kamikaze the same way again. Kyushu, early 1945. The morning air was still. Mist rolled across the rice fields that stretched beyond the runways of Chiren Air Base. Somewhere in the distance, temple bells echoed, soft, slow, solemn. At this quiet edge of Japan, boys were being turned into weapons. They were called Takota, the special attack units. But among themselves they used gentler words. They said they were the ones who will protect Japan. They said they were the wind that will save the homeland. Their commanders spoke with calm conviction. To die beautifully, they said, is to serve the emperor. Your body is a blade. Your spirit, the flame that will purify this war. Each day began before dawn. Cold wash. Inspection. Drills. The sound of engines coughing to life in the half-light. Young men saluting the rising sun, eyes fixed toward the east. The training was relentless. Dive angles, fuel calculation, flight hours, precision strikes. They practiced again and again, never learning how to land. Landing was unnecessary. By night the barracks were quiet. Some played the shamisen softly. Some wrote letters by candlelight. The letters were always the same, filled with calm words, humble gratitude, and unshaken loyalty. But between the lines there was something else. A silence that spoke of fear. Of uncertainty. Of youth pressed too hard beneath the weight of destiny. One of them was 19-year-old Ryoji. A boy from Kagoshima. He had studied philosophy before the draft. He wrote to his mother, "Please do not grieve. I go as a shield for Japan. If I die, know that I believed in our country's peace." He folded the paper carefully, sealed it with trembling hands and smiled, a faint, rehearsed smile that tried to hide the shaking in his chest. Outside, wind whispered through the cherry trees planted by the runway. They were not yet in bloom. Every week, Admiral Takejiro Onishi visited the base. The man who had conceived the kamikaze doctrine. He spoke to them not as soldiers but as sons. He told them Japan's survival rested on their courage. That one life offered willingly could save thousands. And they believed him. Or wanted to believe him. Still, when the lights went out, some stared at the ceiling and asked questions that no one dared to say aloud. Would their sacrifice truly change anything? Would anyone remember their names? Would their deaths mean more than just another plume of smoke over the sea? Ryoji once whispered to his bunkmate, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of dying for nothing." No one replied. They all understood. The next morning, the drums began before sunrise. Rhythmic. Beep. A sound that marked departure. Mechanics checked the propellers, wiped the glass canopies clean. The planes gleamed like metal coffins beneath the pale dawn. Pilots lined up in formation. White headbands. White scarves fluttering in the wind. Their faces young, almost peaceful. A Shinto priest walked past, sprinkling salt, offering blessings. They bowed. They smiled. Some laughed too loudly, pretending not to hear the roaring inside their hearts. At the edge of the field, mothers and sisters stood in silence. They had come to give their last gifts, a lucky charm, a folded crane, a photograph wrapped in cloth. Ryoji's mother was not there. He carried her letter in his pocket, pressed close to his chest. Before stepping into his plane, he took one last look at the sky. It was clear. Almost beautiful. He whispered a prayer, not for victory but for meaning. Engines roared to life. One by one the aircraft rolled toward the runway. Each man saluted. Each man bowed toward the homeland. The drums grew faster, louder, until they drowned out everything: fear, doubt, the sound of his own heartbeat. And as the wheels left the ground, Ryoji felt nothing but weightless calm. Below him, Chiren shrank to a blur of green and gray. Ahead, only clouds, sunlight, and the endless sea. He thought of his letter. He thought of his mother's face. He thought of the words his commander had said: "To die beautifully is to serve." But beauty, he realized, wasn't what he felt. Only silence. Only the wind. And in that silence he understood. He didn't believe in death. He believed in duty. Until duty meant dying. The air over Kyushu was heavy with clouds that morning. By dawn, the mechanics had already lined up the planes, Mitsubishi Zeros, each fitted with a single 500-kilogram bomb bolted beneath the fuselage. Their aluminum skins gleamed faintly, catching the last gray light before sunrise. Ryoji stood beside his aircraft, gloved hands resting on the cold metal. A final salute. A final breath. He knew the truth: no one who took off today would return. There was no return protocol. No route home. Only the sea. He climbed into the cockpit, the smell of oil and steel sharp in the air. The ground crew bowed deeply, faces expressionless. From the tower, a red flag rose. Engines thundered to life. Then the air shook with power and resolve. Takotai launch. One by one the planes began to move, slow at first, then faster, gathering speed until the earth vanished beneath them. From above, Chiren looked like a quiet memory. Below, Japan faded into haze. Ahead lay destiny. Ryoji checked his compass. South-southeast. Target: the American fleet near Okinawa. He adjusted his headband, tightened his grip, and stared into the rising sun. 4 hours, the formation flew low over the waves to avoid radar. The sound of engines was the only voice among them. No chatter on the radio, only coded clicks, simple confirmations that they were still alive, still moving toward the inevitable. As they crossed the open water, Ryoji's mind drifted. He imagined his mother cooking rice in the small wooden house by the sea. He imagined the taste of home. The laughter of his friends before the war. And then he reminded himself, none of that mattered anymore. He had been told that at the moment of impact, all fear would disappear. He wondered if that was true. By noon the clouds broke. Far on the horizon, specks of gray. American ships. Ryoji's heart began to pound. This was it. He clicked the radio twice, the signal for sighting the enemy. Instantly, formation tightened. 10 aircraft like arrows drawn in the sky. Each man whispered his final words. Some shouted "Banzai." Others said nothing at all. Below them, on the steel decks of the radar picket line, American sailors looked up. Aboard the destroyer USS Laffey, radar screens flickered to life. Multiple inbound contacts. Bearing 280, altitude 2,000 feet. The alarm klaxons wailed. Men ran to battle stations. The air was suddenly alive with shouts: "All hands to quarters. Prepare for impact." Captain Frederick Beckton, standing on the bridge, barked orders through the headset. The ship's 40mm and 20mm guns swung skyward, barrels glowing in the midday glare. Shells slammed into the breaches. The deck trembled with the first burst of anti-aircraft fire. Tracer rounds stitched the sky. The blue horizon turned into chaos. Ryoji could see the flak bursting ahead, black clouds forming a wall between life and death. He felt the plane tremble as shrapnel clattered off the wings. Behind him, one of his comrades exploded in midair. A flash of fire, then nothing. Another spiraled downward, trailing smoke, swallowed by the sea. Still, Ryoji pressed forward. His target loomed larger, the gray deck of an American destroyer, guns firing in every direction. He could almost see the faces of the men below, running, shouting, fighting for their lives. The radio hissed with static. Someone's voice broke through: "For the Emperor." And then the world erupted. A shell burst just off his right wing. The Zero shuddered violently. Fire licked up the side of the fuselage. Smoke filled the cockpit. Ryoji coughed, vision blurring. The controls jerked in his hands, half the aileron was gone. He tried to steady the dive. Speed climbed, 300, 350, 400 kilometers per hour. The sea and sky blurred into one. He aimed for the ship's centerline where the guns were thickest. He wanted to hit true, to make it mean something. But the fire grew worse. The engine coughed, then roared, then died. He pulled the stick with everything he had. The plane rolled, twisted, smoke and flame filling his view. For a split second he saw it. The white letters on the hull, USS Laffey. And he thought, I found my destiny. But destiny had other plans. The left wing tore free. The plane spun out of control, missing the ship by less than 30 feet. It struck the water beside the hull. The bomb detonated in a massive plume that shook the vessel to its core. Ryoji felt the impact like a hammer through his body. Then blackness. When he opened his eyes, there was silence. No sound of engines. Only the hiss of steam, the roar of flames, and the groan of twisted steel. He was still strapped to his seat, but the cockpit was half submerged. Salt water burned his face. He gasped, choking on smoke and blood. Somehow, the wreckage had floated up against the destroyer's side. He could see the deck towering above, sailors running with hoses, some shouting, some firing at other incoming planes. Another Zero dove in, and exploded against the aft gun mount, sending a wave of fire across the deck. The Laffey staggered but did not sink. Through the haze, Ryoji realized he was alive. Barely. The thought felt cruel. This was not the glorious death he had been promised. This was chaos, confusion, and pain. He tried to move but his leg was trapped. Each breath came ragged, shallow. He watched another kamikaze plunge into the sea nearby, its bomb failing to detonate. Another hit the ship's radar mast, breaking it in two. The sky was filled with smoke and flame, dozens of planes, dozens of men, ending together in a storm of fire. On deck, the Americans fought desperately. One gun crew, covered in soot and blood, kept firing even as flames licked at their uniforms. One sailor threw himself across a live shell to keep it from exploding. They weren't thinking about ideology or honor. They were thinking about survival. And in that brutal equality of fear, Ryoji saw something he hadn't been told. That the enemy bled the same way. That courage was not one-sided. That dying beautifully was a lie invented by men far from the front. The sea was red now. Oil burned on the surface, spreading in slick ribbons. Bodies drifted. Japanese pilots, American sailors, all claimed by the same indifferent water. The Laffey was hit 22 times that day by kamikaze aircraft and bombs. Yet somehow she refused to die. Her guns kept firing until the last wave broke off and vanished into the clouds. Hours later, as rescue crews began pulling survivors from the wreckage, they found what was left of Ryoji's plane. A shattered fuselage, half buried in flame and foam. There was no name. No identity. Just the remnants of a boy who once wrote to his mother about peace. As night fell, the sea finally calmed. Wreckage floated quietly beneath the stars. For the Americans, it was victory. For Japan, it was another sacrifice. For Ryoji, somewhere between the two, it was silence. He had found his destiny. But destiny had other plans. Smoke still hung over the water like a shroud. The sea hissed quietly as oil fires burned in slow motion. The USS Laffey groaned, her steel plates dented and torn, her deck scarred by 22 kamikaze impacts. But she was still afloat, a wounded beast that refused to die. The sun had begun to set, painting the waves in copper and blood. Sailors moved across the deck with buckets and hoses, washing away the flames, pulling debris overboard. The air smelled of fuel and salt and something darker, something human. Corpsman First Class Daniel Harper leaned over the railing, searching the water. He had been patching wounds since morning, hands shaking, shirt burned in 3 places. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe survivors from one of the other ships, maybe just something to do that didn't involve blood. Then he saw it. A shape drifting among the wreckage. At first he thought it was a burned piece of fuselage. Then it moved. A man. Face half submerged, uniform torn, body tangled in metal. Dark hair plastered to his forehead. Eyes barely open. For a moment Harper just stared. Then the realization hit him. This wasn't one of theirs. The rising sun insignia still faintly visible on the shoulder. A kamikaze pilot. Jesus, someone muttered beside him. Another sailor leaned over, rifle slung low. Don't bother. Let him drown. He tried to kill us. The words hung in the air like smoke. Part of Harper wanted to agree. The man below had probably killed friends, men whose faces he still couldn't forget. But another part of him saw something else. Not an enemy. Just a broken body struggling to breathe. He turned and shouted, "We've got a live one." Port side. A few heads snapped toward him. The ship's deck officer, Lieutenant Jack Reynolds, jogged over, wiping sweat and soot from his face. He looked down at the floating figure, then back at Harper. "Is he one of ours?" "No, sir. Japanese. Pilot." Reynolds hesitated. Around them, sailors had gathered, whispering. One spat into the sea. "After what they did to the aft gun mount. Leave him for the sharks." Another added, "That bastard almost sent us all to hell." The tension was sharp. Rage, grief, exhaustion. Every man on that deck had lost someone that day. And now here was the enemy, helpless and within reach. Reynolds stared for a long moment. Then quietly he said, "Get a rope. Bring him aboard." Someone swore under their breath. Another turned away in disgust. But Harper moved fast. He grabbed a line, looped it, and threw it overboard. The current tugged at it, pulling it toward the drifting body. The man didn't respond. Harper cursed, leaned over the railing and shouted, "Hang on, damn it." The man's eyes flickered. Barely alive. Then, slowly, his hand reached up, weak, trembling, and caught the rope. It took 3 men to haul him in. His flight suit was soaked and heavy, torn open at the shoulder. When they finally pulled him over the railing, he collapsed onto the deck like a rag doll. Blood pooled beneath him. A jagged piece of shrapnel protruded from his thigh. Someone said, "Should have let him sink." Harper ignored it. "Get me a stretcher." "Move." Reynolds knelt beside him, eyes scanning the man's chest. "He's barely breathing. Get him to sick bay." They carried him below deck, through the narrow corridors that still reeked of smoke. The medical bay was chaos, stretchers lined wall to wall, American sailors groaning in pain, some barely conscious. And in the middle of it all now lay the enemy. Dr. Walter Hayes, the ship's chief medical officer, looked up from stitching a wound. His face tightened when he saw who they'd brought. "Who is that?" "Japanese pilot, sir." "Pulled from the water," Harper replied. Hayes stared for a moment, then exhaled. "All right. Get him on the table." Someone protested, "Doc, we've got our own bleeding out." Hayes' voice cut sharp. "We treat the dying, whoever they are. That's the job." The room fell silent. Even the hum of the ship seemed to pause. Harper held the man's wrist, pulse faint, irregular. He cut open what was left of the flight suit, revealing burns across his ribs and fragments of metal embedded deep in the flesh. Hayes worked quickly, hands steady despite the tremor in the ship. Forceps, gauze, morphine. No words. Only the sound of breath and metal and the faint beat of a heart that refused to stop. Hours passed before they stabilized him. By then the night had turned cold. The sea outside was black again. Harper sat beside the bunk, staring at the stranger's face. He looked so young. Barely 20. A boy who had once believed he would die beautifully. Now, bandaged and pale, he looked fragile, like someone's son. When the pilot awoke, it was near dawn. The world around him was white and strange. Canvas walls. Smell of antiseptic. A low hum of engines. He turned his head slowly, eyes wide with confusion. Then he saw the uniforms. Blue shirts. American. Panic shot through him. He tried to sit up, gasped from the pain, and reached instinctively for a weapon that wasn't there. Harper pressed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Easy. You're safe." The words didn't register. Ryoji, his name though no one aboard knew it yet, stared in disbelief. Safe? From them? He remembered the crash, the explosion, the water swallowing him. He remembered praying to die quickly. And now, they had saved him? His voice came out as a whisper, cracked and broken. Why? Harper didn't answer. He wasn't sure himself. Later that morning, the commander came down to the medical bay. Captain Becton moved slowly, leaning on a railing, exhaustion written in every step. He stopped by the bunk, looked down at the Japanese pilot, and for a long moment said nothing. Finally, Ryoji spoke again, haltingly, his English broken but clear enough. "Why, you save me?" Becton's eyes softened. He pulled a chair closer, sat down beside the bed and said quietly, Because we fight soldiers, not the dying. The words seemed to hang in the air. Ryoji blinked, trying to understand. He had been told Americans were beasts, soulless killers who showed no mercy. Yet here they were, tending his wounds, giving him water, sharing their rations. He whispered, your enemy. Becton nodded. Yes, you are. But not today. Ryoji turned his face away. For the first time since he'd climbed into that cockpit, he felt something break inside him. The anger, the pride, the illusions, gone. All that was left was shame. And gratitude. Tears rolled silently down his cheeks. He tried to hide them, but Harper saw. He looked away, pretending not to notice. For the rest of the voyage, Ryoji remained under guard, but no one mistreated him. He listened to the men talk, laugh, curse, and grieve. He watched them share cigarettes and letters from home. He realized they weren't monsters. They were boys just like him. Boys who missed their families, who feared dying, who only wanted to go home. At night, when the ship rocked gently beneath the stars, Ryoji thought of the commander's words. We fight soldiers, not the dying. He repeated them to himself, again and again, like a prayer. He began to understand something his instructors had never taught him, that humanity doesn't belong to one side. That mercy is a kind of courage too. When Harper changed his bandages one evening, Ryoji whispered, "Thank you." The corpsman smiled faintly. "You'd have done the same for me, right?" Ryoji hesitated. Then softly, "I don't know. But I wish I had." The ship kept moving east toward a new day. Outside, the sea was calm again. The war was still raging beyond the horizon, but on that small deck of steel, something had changed. Two enemies had seen each other, not as monsters, not as symbols, but as men. And for the first time since the war began, Ryoji understood what it meant to live. He had fallen from the sky, carrying death in his hands. But what he found in the wreckage of his own failure was something far greater. He found mercy. And that mercy, given freely without reason, was the first step toward peace. The boy woke to silence. No sirens. No orders. No roaring engines. Just the faint hum of a generator somewhere below the deck, and the slow rhythmic beeping of a monitor beside him. He opened his eyes. Above him was a white ceiling. Metal walls. A soft light. For a moment he thought he'd reached some in-between world, not the ocean, not the sky, not even the afterlife he'd been promised. Then he saw the faces. Men in blue uniforms. Americans. The enemy. He tried to sit up, panic flooding his body, but a hand pressed gently on his shoulder. "Easy, son. You're safe." Safe. The word felt foreign, like it belonged to another language. Another world. His side burned with pain. He looked down, bandages wrapped around his ribs, a line of stitches running across his arm. He was alive. But why? Why had they saved him? 4 days he lay there in the ship's infirmary, too weak to move, caught between fever and disbelief. Every now and then he heard laughter from the American sailors outside, rough, booming laughter that filled the narrow metal corridors. Sometimes they sang. Sometimes they cursed. But none of it sounded like hatred. The young pilot watched them through half-closed eyes as they came and went. One man, a corpsman with kind eyes and grease-stained hands, checked his bandages each morning. Another brought him water, poured slowly, patiently. They never struck him. Never mocked him. They just treated him like a man. One afternoon, a soldier sat beside his bed, rolling a cigarette between his fingers. Without a word, he lit it, took a slow drag, and then offered it to him. The pilot hesitated. Then slowly he took it. The smoke stung his throat, but for the first time since the crash, he felt something almost human. The American smiled. "Not bad, huh?" The young man didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Soft, teasing, almost brotherly. He nodded. That night he dreamed of home. His mother's garden in Kagoshima. The cicadas in the summer heat. And the sound of the temple bell calling the faithful to evening prayers. He woke with tears on his face. He didn't even know why. Days turned into weeks. His wounds healed. The nurses changed his bandages less often. He began to eat with the others. Rice from a tin, bits of bread, soup that smelled like something he'd never tasted before. It was strange but not unpleasant. The commander of the ship came to see him one morning. A tall man, gray hair at the temples, calm eyes that held neither anger nor pity. He stood at the foot of the bed and studied the young man for a long time. Then he spoke. "You tried to kill us," he said quietly. The words hit like a blow. The pilot lowered his gaze. The commander didn't raise his voice. He simply continued, "And yet, when we found you in the water, half dead, my men pulled you out. Because we fight soldiers, not the dying." The young man didn't understand all the words, but he caught enough. Fight soldiers, not the dying. Something shifted inside him. A thought that had no place in the world he'd come from. In his training, he had been told that the Americans were monsters, soulless, cruel, bent on destroying Japan's spirit. He believed it. He'd flown into fire believing it. But these men, these enemies, had fed him, clothed him, saved his life. They laughed together. They mourned their dead. They cursed the war. And sometimes in the quiet they looked just as tired as he felt. One night, as the ship rocked gently on the dark Pacific, he spoke his first English words. He looked up at the corpsman beside him and said, "Why?" The man frowned. "Why what?" He pointed to his chest, then to the corpsman. "Why, save me." The sailor was silent for a moment. Then he smiled, a tired, knowing smile. "Because winning a war means nothing," he said slowly, "if we lose our humanity." The boy didn't understand all of it, but he felt it, deep in the quiet ache of his heart. That night he wept. Not from pain. Not from guilt. But from the sudden, unbearable weight of understanding. He had flown to die for honor. Now he lived because of mercy. He thought of Admiral Onishi's words, the architect of the kamikaze, "If you are to die, die beautifully." But here, under the hum of American lights, he realized, there was nothing beautiful about dying. Only the living could give beauty meaning. Days later he was strong enough to walk. He limped through the ship's narrow corridors, the sailors parting to let him pass. Some looked at him with curiosity. Some nodded. No one spat. No one sneered. At the far end of the deck, the sea stretched out endlessly, blue, vast, indifferent. He stood there for a long time, the wind in his face, the smell of salt and oil in the air. Somewhere far beyond that horizon lay his home. Somewhere, his mother still waited for a letter that would never come. He closed his eyes. In the rhythm of the waves he heard two worlds colliding. One he had left behind, one he didn't yet belong to. He was a soldier without a war, a believer without a faith, a son without a country. But for the first time he was alive. And in that fragile space between two worlds, he began to understand what it meant to be human. The sea was calm the morning the news arrived. No alarms. No gunfire. Only the low murmur of voices drifting through the corridors of the ship. The young pilot sat on the edge of his bunk, hands resting in his lap, as the American crew gathered around the radio. The voice coming through the static was trembling, but clear enough to understand even for someone who barely knew the language. "Japan has surrendered." No one cheered. No one spoke for a long time. The war that had devoured millions of lives had ended, not with another explosion but with silence. He didn't know what to feel. The words sank in slowly, like stones dropped into deep water. Japan surrendered. The emperor spoke. The war was over. He should have felt relief. But what rose in his chest instead was confusion and grief. For years, he had been told that dying for the emperor was the greatest honor. That Japan would never surrender. That defeat was impossible. Now, in a few short words carried across the Pacific, everything he had believed in vanished. He sat there for hours, staring at the floor as laughter and tears broke out around him. Some Americans hugged one another. Some stood in quiet disbelief. The ship's bell rang out, steady and solemn. And still he could not move. That night, the commander came to see him again. He looked older now. The war had carved lines into his face that no victory could erase. He placed a folded paper on the table beside the young man's bed. "Orders," he said softly. "You'll be transferred soon." The pilot nodded. He wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. A week later they took him ashore. The air smelled of diesel and salt, and the docks were crowded with men. Some wounded, some silent, all waiting for what came next. He was among a small group of Japanese prisoners escorted to a transport ship bound for Guam. There they would be processed, treated, and eventually sent home. Home. A word that once meant everything, now it felt hollow. On the deck of the transport, he stood watching the waves roll by, endless and indifferent, just as they had been before the war. The American sailors were different here, quieter, gentler. Some nodded at him when they passed. One even handed him a small packet of food. "Good luck," he said. 2 words. Simple. Human. In Guam, he was held in a camp surrounded by barbed wire and palm trees. There were hundreds like him, young, thin, haunted. Some still spoke of honor, of the emperor, of revenge. Others sat silently, staring at their hands, unsure what any of it meant anymore. He spent his days helping in the infirmary, translating small phrases, cleaning supplies, anything to fill the time. At night, he wrote in a small notebook the Americans had given him. Letters that would never be sent. Words he could barely understand himself. "I lived," he wrote. "I was supposed to die, but I lived. They saved me. They fed me. They treated me like a man." What? Weeks turned into months. The war crimes trials began. Cities lay in ashes. The emperor renounced his divinity. And slowly ships began to take the survivors home. When his turn came, he stood on the dock and looked back at the camp, the place where his old self had quietly died. One of the American corpsmen who had once tended his wounds came to see him off. "Take care of yourself," the man said, holding out his hand. For a moment the pilot hesitated. Then he took it. Their hands met, not as enemies but as men who had survived the same storm. The journey back to Japan was quiet. As the ship neared Kagoshima, he saw the coastline rise from the mist, green hills scarred by bomb craters, towns half buried in rubble. He felt a strange ache in his chest. Not pride. Not shame. Something deeper. When he stepped ashore, no one saluted. No one cheered. There were no parades for the survivors. Only tired faces, empty homes, and the faint smell of smoke still clinging to the earth. He found his mother in what was left of their house. Walls patched with wood, the old garden gone to weeds. She didn't cry. She only touched his face, whispered his name and said, "You came back." He wanted to tell her everything. The fear, the confusion, the strange kindness of those he'd called the enemy. But the words caught in his throat. All he could say was, "Yes, mother. I came back." That night, he sat outside beneath the stars, the same stars he had seen from the cockpit of his 0 months before. He thought of the men who never returned. Of those who believed dying beautifully would save their country. Of those who still waited for a glory that never came. He realized then that he was no hero. He was simply a survivor. But perhaps that was enough. Because survival meant memory. It meant he could remember the laughter of his enemies, the mercy in their hands, the humanity that war had tried to erase. Years later, when people asked him what it was like to be a kamikaze, he would pause before answering. Then he would say softly, "I returned home a survivor, not a hero, but something greater, a man reborn." And in that quiet, honest confession, the divine wind finally came to rest. Decades had passed. The war was no longer a roaring inferno, no longer a daily fear or a relentless command. It existed now only in memory, in the quiet ache behind his eyes. He stood on a cliff above the waters of Okinawa, the wind tugging gently at the thin jacket draped over his shoulders. The sea stretched endlessly before him, blue and calm, dotted with distant fishing boats and the faint white froth of waves breaking against the rocks. For a long time, he simply watched, the sound of the ocean filling the spaces where the screams and alarms of his youth once lived. He could still remember the day he had fallen from the sky, the crash and fire, the chaos and the smell of oil and salt. He could still feel the heat of the flames and the sting of shrapnel. But more vividly than the destruction, more persistently than the fear, was the memory of hands reaching for him. Hands that should have struck him down, that should have condemned him to death, yet instead lifted him from the water, held him, saved him. He could see them clearly in his mind, the corpsman with grease-stained hands, the surgeon's steady fingers, the commander's calm gaze. Men who had never known him, yet treated him as more than an enemy. They had offered him water, medicine, comfort, humanity. And in doing so they had reshaped the world he thought he knew. The old pilot closed his eyes, letting the wind carry him back across decades. He remembered waking in the infirmary for the first time, realizing he was alive and not understanding why. He remembered hearing the laughter of sailors, their careless songs, their arguments over cards and cigarettes, and the strange sense that even in war life could still be gentle. He remembered asking the question that had haunted him since the crash, "Why?" And the reply, soft and unwavering, that had become his lodestar ever since, "Winning a war means nothing if we lose our humanity." He thought of the nights on deck, the endless Pacific stretching out under the stars, the quiet moments of shared cigarettes and words that barely needed translation. He remembered tears he had shed then and tears he still shed now, not from shame or fear, but from the weight of understanding, the weight of realizing that even in a world designed to divide and destroy, compassion could prevail. Years had aged him, bent him, left lines and scars that no one could see beneath his uniform of ordinary life. But the lesson remained untouched. Enemies are easy to make. Hatred comes naturally. Compassion does not. It must be chosen. Every time. He thought of the sailors who had saved him. Many were long gone. Some returned to quiet lives, their heroism unnoticed outside the small circles of their shipmates. But their impact endured. Because in that single act of mercy, they had rewritten a life, altered the course of a soul, and proven that humanity could persist even in the darkest hours. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had once gripped the controls of a plane meant to die in fire, now resting calmly at his sides. He remembered the first time he walked again, the first time he breathed air not heavy with smoke, the first time he understood the difference between duty and cruelty. It was a lesson he carried quietly, never boasting, never demanding recognition. A lesson he shared only in whispers and reflections, when the wind was right and the sea answered back. He closed his eyes again, letting the memory of that day and the mercy he received settle like a tide within him. He remembered the words the commander had spoken so long ago, "You are my enemy but not today." They had been more than words. They had been a choice. A declaration that even in war there were limits. That even amid death and destruction humanity could be preserved. He thought of the countless young men and women who had served on both sides, the lost, the wounded, the forgotten. He thought of families grieving, of cities rebuilt, of nations learning that survival was not measured in victories alone, but in the courage to remain human. And he realized something fundamental. The true triumph of that war was not in territory gained, nor in battles won. It was in the moments like this, rare, quiet, and nearly invisible, where mercy outweighed vengeance and compassion became a weapon stronger than steel. He opened his eyes and looked once more across the Okinawan waters. The sun was low, spilling gold over the waves, touching the horizon with light that seemed to promise something beyond conflict, beyond loss. And in that light, he remembered the hands that had saved him, the hearts that had chosen humanity over hatred, the courage to act with kindness when no one was watching. He whispered to the sea, to the wind, to whatever forces had carried him through the years, "In war, enemies are easy to make. Compassion is not." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, he smiled softly, a quiet, serene understanding settling over him. Because in that simple truth lay the victory America had always fought for. Not flags, not cities, not medals. But the enduring choice to preserve the dignity of life itself. The old man turned from the cliff, his gaze lingering one last time on the waters that had once nearly claimed him. He carried within him the memory of mercy, the echo of humanity, and the certainty that in any circumstance, the final victory is always won by compassion. And as he walked slowly toward the path leading home, he murmured the words that had guided him through a lifetime of reflection. Under any circumstances, being humane is in America's ultimate interest.